don't have people come here, we send our best and brightest somewhere else to steal their ideas. So what did we do? So this was work that we had in 68 infants with cystic fibrosis, and we saw them 95 times when they were babies, and we also had some healthy controls, so they didn't have any cystic fibrosis. We measured their infant lung function, and we also did the lung washes that Luke was talking about and measured the bugs that they had in their lungs at the time. And then we continued to do that, and then we measured their sort of normal spirometry, so when you come into the lab every 3 months and we get you to take a big breath and blow as long and hard as you can. I was talking to Wendy earlier about not really missing that actually. But what we followed is, of these 68 infants, we managed to get data on 56 of them when they were about 5 or 6 years of age. And over that 5 or 6 years, these 50 children had done 270 lung function tests. So you're in there fairly regularly. We weren't so good at keeping our healthy children, but we had 18 of those that we followed through. And what did we find? So this is, so I'm sure many of you remember that the numbers you all hang on are FEV1 and forced vital capacity, and sometimes also the ratio of the two. But when you're very small and you're a baby, you can't blow out for 1 second, so we can't do FEV1. So what we talk about is the forced expiratory volume in 3/4 of a second, because the babies can't blow out that long. And so what you have here is their actual measurements, and this is their height. So as newborn babies, they're around 50 centimetres, all the way up to when they were sort of 5 or 6. And what we found is that if you had either a healthy control or you had never been infected in the first 2 years of life, so that means on the lung wash, you hadn't had Pseudomonas, which everybody knows, you're all aware of Pseudomonas and wanting to avoid that. But what we also have shown is that if you hadn't had any form of the Aspergillus species, Staph aureus or Haemophilus, that the lung function of those children with CF was exactly the same as healthy children who did not have cystic fibrosis. If you had any infection in the first 2 years of life, so somewhere between 50 and about 90 centimetres tall on this, your lung function was about 12% lower at school age. So if you think about some of the treatments that you or your children have now, so Pulmazine or some of the others, we'd expect that with those treatments, or Lidocaine, that with your treatments, that your lung function would go up 10 to 15%. A change of more than 10% in lung function in a short period of time is a lot. So what we've shown is that if you had one of these bugs in the first 2 years of life, when you were 7, your lung function was 12% lower. We know that the lung function you have when you're 6 or 7 tracks, so it follows the same path as the lung function you have when you're 13 or 14, as the same lung function you have when you're 23 or 24 with cystic fibrosis. So what this really means is, and Steve touched on this editorial, so when you write these publications and you submit them to the journals and they get accepted, every now and again the journal thinks it's important enough to have an editorial. So that's a little bit like opening up the West, and the big issue of the day is always there in the column. If it's the West, it's usually a little bit right-wing. But this was this editorial. So this was a comment from CF physicians in the US in the leading respiratory journal in the world. The clinical implications of this study are profound. These results support strong, early and aggressive management of airway infection in the first 2 years of life. Could result in long-term effects on lung health. Now we know that if we find Pseudomonas, that we treat that very aggressively with tobramycin and other antibiotics. In this study, we also found that children who'd been on augmentin in the first 2 years of life, their lung function was 10% better at school age than the children who were not taking their augmentin. So perhaps a small message there is if your physician gives you augmentin to give to your child, perhaps you should be very proactive about following that prescription. But what we haven't done as a sort of in our clinical care is we haven't really aggressively pursued some of these other bugs. They were thought to be almost bystander bugs. And this work and some other work that we have coming out and really suggests that that's not the case. This will change the way we manage early CF lung disease. It means that doing things like these lung washes are critically important because we'll be able to find out whether these bugs that are there and potentially treat them. And it could mean that lung function in children where we can eradicate those bugs could be anywhere between 12 and 15% higher when they start school. And on that note,
well, thank you, Grant. Are there questions from the floor? Don't be shy. Did you hear what he said?
Yeah.
I'll get another drink.
I might just add a historical perspective to this. The picture that Graham showed of the lung function box is a brand new, spanking new commercial version of what we started with, which was back in 1994 when a group met at the Chelsea Tavern. And we worked out a way of setting up some valves and a pump, and if you press the buttons in a certain order, you could produce these forced expiratory flows. And Deborah Turner, who's now the right-hand person for the Chief Medical Officer, had to memorise which order A, J, G, J, G, K to get the test. And then it got, computers came in, and they really didn't have an impact until the mid to late 1990s in what we were doing. And then we built a much more sophisticated machine with a reverse flow vacuum cleaner, and it was actually controlled by a computer, and that was excellent. But in fact, then we missed an opportunity with patents, and two companies went off and made much more professional looking machine. So it was a very nice picture of that, but we ought to retain those old pictures, the way we used to do things. Because I was looking at some of the parents, they weren't, their kids weren't done.
Some people remember the clunky kind of box. So no questions.
With relation to the voluntary lavage, is it how successful is fusion samples in comparison to the voluntary lavage?
So there are some data looking at that, and in children where you can get induced sputum from them, and it tends to be in older children, they are reasonably comparable. The problem is that getting a 6-month-old baby to produce sputum is tricky. As you know, getting a 6-month-old baby to do anything like genital pollen is hard. So the problem becomes one of reliability and the ability to know that you're going to get those measurements or that lavage, that sample from the lung when you need it. So one of the reasons why the AREST CF program stops at around 5 or 6 years of age for the lavage is that from that point on we know that we can use things like hypertonic saline to get induced sputum measurements, even in those kids who don't have a productive cough. But if you're 6 months or 1 or 2 years of age, it's much harder to do that, and so it becomes more of a burden. And while I'm not going to pretend that what happens up in theatres when you have those lavages isn't scary for the children and the families, we know that we get the information that we need from that. And because we match those with the CT scans that Tim's about to talk about, we're taking the opportunity to get as much as we can and ensure that as possible.
I'll just add one more point to that, and that is the bugs that we've recently identified as being particularly troublesome in the first 6 months to 2 years are bugs that are commonly found in the upper airway. And so you don't, and they're high carriage rates in the general population. So you and I may well have staphylococcus in our nose and throat. So finding it on an induced sputum may not mean that it's actually down in the lungs. So if you're now going to advocate quite aggressive interventions to try and get rid of these bugs, you actually want to know that they're there. So that's why the BA is quite important.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, one more. Sorry.
given the change in the thinking and the early intervention around Pseudomonas in particular, how successful do you believe the treatments can be in terms of keeping the Pseudomonas out of an early CF patient from a clinical perspective versus, say, someone who was treated decades ago into, I guess, in an older era?
Yeah, I think when you look at the shift in survival rates, lung function, transplant, all of those markers of disease progression and cystic fibrosis, they have exponentially backed ahead in the right direction in the last 20 to 25 years. And a lot of that has been because of the multidisciplinary care that happens. And also a lot of that is when we're starting to manage kids earlier. We know that the longer that we can delay the onset of Pseudomonas, the better the outcomes are. So every year that you can delay someone getting infected with Pseudomonas is years added to the average age of lung transplant, for example. And so if we translate that to some of these other bugs that we've found, if we can then go for more, so this is, I guess, where the combat CF has started, these early intervention trials with antibiotics. If we can now move to being more proactive and a bit more aggressive in the first 2 years of life with preventing any of these bugs occurring, we can make massive changes. Because it's the period when your lungs do the most growth. In the first 2 years of life, the volume of your lung more than doubles. And then between 2 and 5, it more than doubles again. There is no other period in your life where you have that big a change in the size of the lungs. The more you can do to maximise that growth and not slow it down, the better the outcome will be, not only at 5 or 6 or 7, but 15, 16, 23, 53. And so we could really change not only how these kids are at school, but how they are as adults, how they university, careers, families, and options that the clinical teams didn't talk about 20 years ago will now become common.
Just one more point. Is Rama's here? Just stand up a bit, Rama provides one of our research diaries, and Felice mentioned to me an article that was published a little while ago about Pseudomonas and about how starving it of iron can stop it progressing. That was a study predominantly done in a test tube. Rama's actually doing a clinical trial at the moment here and at Charlie's with an intervention that starves Pseudomonas of iron, and that will hopefully translate into a therapy because it's a drug that's already available that will actually keep Pseudomonas at bay for longer. So rather than doing it in a test tube, we're actually doing it in patients. We've got a clinical trial already underway. So, and Rama's... Oh, absolutely. It's been done here and at Charles. So,
yeah, just to add to that, Pseudomonas is one such bug, as clever as most of us are, it has transformed in such a way that, it forms a biofood and it requires iron for growing and for multiplying. So even when we treat the Pseudomonas, we try to get rid of the most accessible Pseudomonas, but there are still Pseudomonas sitting there covered by the umbrella of the biofilm. So that's the Pseudomonas that we want to get rid of. So you are actually free of Pseudomonas for a long time. If you can imagine, most of the adolescents who are more than 18 that we're seeing in Charlie's, 80% of them have Pseudomonas infection, and studies have shown that they're all same family of genetically. The Pseudomonas that's there 20 years ago is the same Pseudomonas that's there. So if we can get rid of the Pseudomonas to the core, then probably we can prevent that ongoing damage that's happening. So that's one of our aims of the TED study, which is tobromycin with EUPA. So we get those results hopefully by the end of this year.
Also mentioning that Rama also has a topic scholarship for the PhD in CFWA. And I might sit down, I'm very happy to talk to everybody afterwards.
Well, thank you very much, Graham. There does seem to be an overriding theme with alcohol and this thinking juice here, Steve, but we probably shouldn't spend too much time talking about that. Our next presenter is Tim Rosenow. Tim is in the final year of his PhD in chest CT outcomes in early CF lung disease, and is also the recipient of the CFWA Lung Distance Runners Top-Up Scholarship. His talk this evening is on a technique that he developed at TKI called Pragma, and I'm hoping that Tim will tell us what Pragma is, because I couldn't figure it out. The first clinical trial outcome in CF using chest CT that is designed for infants and preschoolers. The publication for this method is currently under review in the Blue Journal, which is the highest rated respiratory medical journal. Please, ladies and gentlemen, make some welcome.
Thanks, Nigel. And an update I found this morning is it's now accepted into that journal, so we have a public you don't get to brag much in science, so I have to do it now and then. So Steve thankfully already introduced most of my talk, which was that the lack